So,
Little fireside chat.
so Roger, I thought I'd start off, and I haven't changed all the questions, even though I joked that I would. I wanted to start off and point out that I joined Minto 10 years ago, almost. Okay. So about this time in 2008, I was under the hot lights interviewing for the job of a lifetime with Minto. And now it's my turn to do it to you 10 years later.
Well, the good news is that I'm still sort of ultimately your boss, so you have to be careful somewhat. I don't think this is going to be an investigative type question, but
All right.
We'll see. Maybe you give a zinger or two in there.
All right. So, Roger, many of the audience members here might not actually be aware of the full history of Minto. So, can you take an opportunity to walk us through sort of the origin of Minto and then when you became involved?
So the company began in 1955. It was four brothers that started off the business. My father was one of the four brothers. By the early 1960s, two went separate ways. One ultimately became the mayor of the city of Ottawa in the 1970s, and the other one retired. So it was really my Uncle Irving and my father who grew the company and then expanded geographically into the United States in the late 70s, and gradually also three of my brothers and myself joined the business, and my cousin Dan joined the business. My father passed away in 1980 very suddenly at the age of 57. You'll come to see why the significance of that is in a few minutes, but he passed away from a heart attack without any advance warning in 1980, and then my uncle passed away in 1991 after a bout of cancer. So by that point in time, we were active in Toronto, Ottawa, and South Florida. And then we've been running things since then as second generation since 1991.
So can you talk a little bit about when you took over as CEO?
So it was as Andrew pointed out, it was an interesting time to take over. It's not something that we had planned. In fact, my uncle had notwithstanding his cancer for about a year and a half or so, if he didn't talk about succession, we didn't talk about succession. So when he passed away, there hadn't been a lot done, but there was sort of a tacit acknowledgement. I'm not the oldest in our family, but it was recognized. The analogy that I've often used is an orchestra. And all of us were quite fond of and enjoyed being in the orchestra. And my uncle was the orchestra leader. And when he passed away, someone had to give up the instrument, walk down to the front, and become the orchestra leader, and that role fell to me.
So what are some of the biggest changes when you took over the CEO role suddenly? What are some of the biggest changes you made in the first few years in that position?
Well, my uncle's personality was challenging, to put it nicely. I mean, he was, on the one hand, was extremely friendly, warm, and outgoing, and on the other hand was extremely tough, demanding, and blunt and direct. And so when people would ask me during the period of time when I started working for Minto full-time in 1985, what's it like working with Irving? And I say, I don't work with Irving, I work for Irving. And on more than one occasion, he looked at me straight in the eyes and said, kid, it's my way or the highway. And notwithstanding that we were the 50% owner of the company, basically we were treated like mushrooms, kept in the dark, and shoveled on top of us. None of us ever saw financial statements of the company. We would know what our own particular areas were doing, but we never had a sense of the company as a whole. He kept it all to himself. He was very, very private that way. When he passed away, one of the first decisions I made was that I had been reading a lot in the newspapers about other families and the challenges that they had, in particular where nobody seemed to know what was going on, and there were lawsuits flying around left, right, and center. And so one of the key decisions that I made early on was I was going to go the exact opposite route. We're going to have regular family meetings. We're going to have budgets. We're going to have statements that were going to be produced. We would have investment recommendations. So just a completely much more open and transparent process with everybody, so that nobody could say if something went wrong in a real estate deal, which it did once or twice, nobody could say, well, you didn't tell us about that. Well, yes, we did. Here was the business plan, and it laid out what the risks were. So it's a very open and transparent process of what's one of the key things that I think I initiated.
And as part of that was the first board.
Well, that came much later. So I think that when for the first number of years, I think if you'd said, so what would have happened right at the very beginning, under my tenure. My Aunt Shirley and her two children had a decision to make whether they wanted to stay in the business or not. At that point in time, my cousin Dan had stepped out of the business, so there were 4 of us from my side of the family who were active, and there were 4 or 5 other shareholders, what we called investor shareholders. And so people had to decide what they wanted to do. So interestingly, my aunt, the leader of her group at that point, said, we don't want the vision for Minto, for Irving, to die with him. We want to give you guys a chance to continue with what my father and Irving had started. And so that began a process in 1991 of renewal and going forward with what we wanted to do.
So during your years at Minto, who are some of the people you'd say you admire the most?
Well, clearly Irving, notwithstanding the challenges of working for him, he was an absolutely brilliant real estate operator. I mean, I've met Ray Sahi a few times, and Ray sort of reminds me a little bit of my uncle, very somewhat bombastic at times, but a tremendous understanding and inherent knowledge of real estate. So that was one. And then the second person, I would say, would be the Dean of Lawyers in Ottawa, a fellow by the name of Hy Soloway. And what I admired about Hy was his ability, his calmness, and his ability to get along with everybody and anybody. And I think that was a trait that anyone who knows my siblings and the other shareholders at Minto know that that trait has been one that has been put well to use over the course of the last 25 years.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what would you say during your time at Minto, leading Minto, are the moments that you're most proud of?
Well, I think what I'm most proud of is not necessarily a moment, but rather the whole moment. I mean, I'm extremely proud of the legacy that my father and my uncle left for us, and now the legacy that we're leaving for the next generation of Greenberg family members. To be in business for 63 years in real estate, and to be successful in most all of them, is through thick and thin, through ups and downs, through lots of challenges. I think was absolutely my proudest moment, so to speak, or my proudest achievement. But if I had to think about 2 particular events, when Andrew talks about 1991 and taking over at a very difficult time, we had construction financing for what was our largest project at the time, Minto Place in Ottawa. It was a $120 million construction financing, and we were arranging permanent financing. And I remember going on the tour, and we ended up in the boardroom with a bunch of the bondholders who are going to be the permanent lenders. And one of the fellows noted, he said, geez, Roger, I noticed that the construction financing is $120 million, but your takeout financing is only $100 million. What are you going to do about the difference? And I said, well, the $20 million is sitting in the bank waiting to pay off the mortgage. And I think that you can just sort of feel the calmness coming over the room at that answer. And then you take that fast forward to the launch of our REIT earlier this summer. I think when all of us got together they call it ring the bell for the TSX, which I'll let you in on a secret. It's not a bell, it's a button, and it doesn't really do anything other than it glows for a picture. So that was kind of a bit of I found that out in the morning. But anyways, we did that about 3 weeks ago, and that was a really terrific moment because it represented to me a transition. My CEO successor, Michael Waters, is the one that did all the tough slugging on that, and it's sort of like being like the proud father, sort of seeing your child, take a very, very big step, and that was a tremendous achievement for us.
So you've ruined it for everybody, the secret behind the bell.
Well.
So we talk about what we're proud of the accomplishments at Minto. What, flipping it on its head, would you say some of the biggest hurdles that you've overcome in your time with Minto?
Well, I think people would have said after Irving passed away, he cast such a big shadow over all of us and everybody in the company and in Ottawa and everything that was going on. I think the common wisdom, if there is such a thing, was that we wouldn't survive 6 months. That's what people were saying. And that the brothers had never worked together, which is true. We had all worked in our own little silos. And so we were all pretty strong-minded individuals. And the common wisdom was that we wouldn't get along and we'd be bankrupt in 6 months. So my words to the family were the sort of the rod, the stick approach. I said, listen, none of us can hold a candle to Irving and all of his intelligence and his brilliance, and so we shouldn't ever try to measure ourselves against him, his accomplishments, and his basic abilities. But I have a feeling it's a bit like one rod, you can break that easily enough. If you put two together, it gets a little tougher. You put three, you get four, you get five. If you try to break 5 rods together, 5 sticks together, you can't. And so I said, let's stick together. Let's agree on a common vision of what we want to do and how we're going to go about doing it. And I think if we do that, I have a feeling we're going to be successful. And that's the approach we did.
So a few years ago, there was a very conscious decision to move away from family leadership to non-family leadership. Right. Can you talk a little bit about why this change was made?
Well, come from a family history where, unfortunately, particularly heart disease and cancer had a devastating impact on our family. My parents, I mentioned that my father died at 57 from a heart attack. My mother died at 59 from cancer. So neither of them made it to 60. And actually, most male Greenbergs did not make it past the age of 60, mostly died of heart disease. My grandfather, 2 uncles. My oldest brother, my youngest brother have had heart attacks. My youngest brother had his first heart attack at 38. So I think that I very much believe that you're a product of the environment that you're brought up in. And so I had said to the family at 35, when I took over being the conductor of the orchestra, I thought at the time that 15 years sounded like a reasonable length of time to have the burden of responsibility. So when I was 50, I would step back. As I got to be 44, sort of 44, 45, I sort of thought, what the heck am I going to do at 50? Like, my kids are young, I can't travel a lot, whatever. So, okay, I'll wait another 5 years. So we actually didn't start until I was closer to 55, and it was a process that began at that point in time. So I think it was the realization that, particularly as a private family business, if everything goes to hell in a handbasket after you've gone, what have you done? What have you accomplished? Because it's all of our value was caught up in the company. And it just seemed to me that while we lucked out in the transition with my uncle, I sort of make it akin to the comment I've made often is the analogy is going to Vegas, taking the whole family fortune, going up to the roulette table and saying, let's put it all on red and see what happens. So people said, well, worked first time, why don't you do it again? I said, no, I don't think so. So we began a process, to make a very, very planned leadership succession from myself, because neither of my brothers who were active in the business at the time wanted to become CEO. It meant that we had to move outside the family because our kids are way too young. So it meant that we had to bring in, or in this case, we ultimately ended up promoting from within to new CEO leadership.
So there's probably a number of owners out here that actually are families that own real estate. Can you talk a little bit about what was the actual process that you followed through that transition?
Well, it was a lot of discussion. So, because one of the things that was important was, what are the roles that my brothers want to play in a post my leadership? What am I going to do in a post leadership? We had a longtime consigliere, so to speak, had been with us, had been my number 2 person for many, many years. So we brought on board change consultants who helped us a lot. And had a lot of discussion. We involved the senior leadership in it, and it was just tremendous amount of communication, tremendous amount of transparency to the family of what we were doing, to the senior leadership team, what we were doing, and to the staff, so that it didn't come as a huge surprise. And I think because everybody knew Michael Waters so well, because he had been our CFO, and then we promoted him to become the leader of our Ontario Housing Group. Everybody knew him and had a high degree of comfort level with him, plus that I made the statement that I was going to become executive chair as opposed to chair. And the difference is not quite what it is in the United States. In the United States, I know that executive chair typically means it's chairman of the board and CEO. In this case, I would be chairman of the board, but I would be heavily involved with Michael in establishing strategy. I knew Michael had all of our values down pat. We were very together on how we wanted to run the company. And then we worked together in the strategy, and then Michael is responsible for implementation.
Well, and I can say personally, being in the company, you were great at communicating what the process was going to be. So I think the staff knew exactly what was happening, and now you still sit with us on the second floor.
Yep, there we go.
So despite the fact that you moved to non-family leadership, you're still chairman on the Minto board, as well as on the Minto Apartment REIT board. You remain involved in many of the decisions with Michael. He drives the strategy, he consults with you. So in addition to the role you play with Minto, can you talk a little bit about the role your family plays in the oversight of the company today?
Well, one of the key things that we did, and it's coming up to 10 years now, is I made the decision, and I brought that, let me rephrase that, I didn't make the decision. I came up with the recommendation and made the recommendation to the family that we establish an independent board. And the family agreed with that, and we went out, we recruited some top flight individuals to come and be board members. And so we have a 9-member board where there's 5 independents and 4 non-independents. And notwithstanding the fact that we're a closely held company, and everybody knows, in theory, that if the board ever goes against what we want to do as a family, we can always unelect them, or whatever the word would be. That would be a huge loss for us. And so, notwithstanding that that's known, we've never done it that way. I've treated the board as if they were truly independent. We have votes and we have discussions, and I listen very carefully. They are very bright, capable individuals. Most are former CEOs and have been unbelievably helpful. I think it's now 10 years since we've had them, have been extremely helpful. So the family's always maintained that as an oversight. It was meant to be as a bit of an emergency situation in case, I got in a car accident or had a heart attack or something, and then have something that would be able to step in and sort of guide things and manage things as a transition. So that's been a key part. And then we've had family members. We set up a family council, family office, probably 8 years ago now. So we have a very fully functioning president of our family office and a fully staffed family office. And we're getting 3rd generation involved now. We have a family council that meets twice a year, and trying to get as much involvement with the 3rd generation as we can. Doesn't always work. We have 2 family members that are overseas right now, so they're unable to make meetings and stuff, but we try our best. So it's there's nobody active in the business today now in the 3rd generation, but that could change. There's still, a lot of them are still very young, just starting off. The youngest is just starting university, so we'll see how things go.
So late last year, we decided to do a little project, and we called that the Minto Apartment REIT. Taking the company public, or part of the company public, was a huge undertaking for the staff, for yourself, for the family. So I'm going to ask you the same question I asked you about bringing in non-family leadership. Why did you go public? Why did we go public?
I think we went public for 2 reasons. The lesser reason, well, they're probably equal. I think the one reason is recognizing that the family shareholders are getting on in age, and when those of us who are married, when the survivor of ourselves and our spouses pass away, or in my case, my family members, I have 3 or 4 that are not married right now, there's going to be a lot of taxes to pay. And nobody likes the idea of having their children have to approach their aunts and uncles for a loan in order to be able to pay taxes. So I think to provide liquidity to family members in order to be able to do that was one feature. And then secondly is the opportunity to grow. I think I've understood that right since 1991, and the real estate is a hugely capital-intensive business to be in, and as appreciative as we are to Andrew and the TD Bank for making a tremendous amount of capital available, as with the other banks that we deal with, that's not enough. And so we've done a number of different strategies, and it just seemed like taking our apartment business public seemed like the right idea to tap into the marketplace.
Perfect. So as you went through the process of the IPO, I know you would have had a different perspective of the experience than I did. So how did you keep the family shareholders informed through the process?
Two ways. We created a special committee of the board so that the family members knew that there was a smaller group of the board members who were meeting very regularly, maybe a bit too regularly for Michael and his staff, but that was what the board members wanted to do. So I think that they were quite involved. We had one board member in particular who had taken a number of companies public, so had a wealth of experience in what he was doing. So that was one way. And then we had regular update calls with the family, conference calls that were arranged. I would arrange every 6 weeks or so we had reports from Michael to update the family all the way through. And we had a go, no go sort of 2 weeks before going public, and I just made sure that everybody was comfortable. There were lots of issues. I have two siblings that live in the United States, so there were tremendous tax complications to get worked through, and we had to make sure everybody was comfortable with what we were doing, so that's what we did.
Excellent. So what do you find is going to be the biggest change, having been with Minto as long as you have, that going public is going to bring?
Well, I talked earlier about the transparency. And I think one of the keys of my success has been that everybody in the family knows what we're doing. They as I talked about the business plans and all of that sort of stuff. So I'm not quite sure why this didn't come to me earlier in the process, but about a week after we had gone public, Michael and I were having coffee and just sort of going through that, and he was calming down after a very, very hectic period of time in his life. And he said, Roger, you're going to have to change your interaction with the shareholders and the board, and the Minto board. What do you mean, Michael? He said, well, you and me and our third board member, who's a member of the board of trustees, he says, we're insiders of the REIT. Your family, the Minto board, they're shareholders in the REIT, but they're not insiders in the same way that you are. So you cannot tell them anything about the future plans of the REIT. Oh. and as soon as he said it, I knew instantly that he was right. I just had not even thought about it for a moment. And so we're still working through. We have our first board meeting since the REIT was launched, the Minto board, next week, and first family meeting, formal meeting, will be a few weeks after that. So I haven't quite worked through with Michael and our CFO, how is it that I can only present stuff that the REIT has identified publicly, cannot talk about plans, about what we're doing. And I'm not sure, can I even say that we have lots of plans? Is that reaching anything? I have to be careful here. I'll have to.
Michael's not here, right?
Yeah, but I can't talk about that sort of stuff. So I don't like keeping secrets from my family. So I have to sort of figure out how that can be dealt with in a way that is respectful of the securities legislation and not putting anybody offside.
So with all the success Minto's had under your leadership, and you think about things like really good planning and luck, what role do you think each of those things had in your success over the years?
Well, I've long said, and my son commented negatively when I said this as part of a speech I gave to graduating students at Algonquin College a couple of years ago. I've always said that I think there are three ingredients that are needed to be successful in business, and I've rarely met a successful business person who doesn't have all three of these. So number one, you have to be smart. Number two, you have to work hard. And number three, you have to have luck. And if I could ask the big man upstairs for any more of one of those three elements, I would take luck every time. I think we've been blessed with being lucky, and I think it's an understated element of what we deal with, and if I could have any more of that at any point in time, I'd take luck every time.
So we have a couple more minutes. I'd like to ask you and share with the audience, you keep yourself very he emphasized, I said very twice, very, very busy outside of Minto. Can you share a little bit about OSEG, the Red Blacks, and the other things that are keeping you busy? Very, very busy.
Well, I mean, everybody sort of says, well, how are you enjoying retirement? And the reality is that with my kids out of the house and my wife is fortunately not the clingy type and runs a very successful food blog. If anybody wants to look up saltandserenity.com, I get a dime for every person that logs on with her food blog for subscribers. So she's an excellent cook and she's constantly working away at that. So I don't need to dote on her every day. And I'm actually with all of the things going on now in life, I'm actually busier today than I think I've ever been in my career. So with the OSEG side, the Ottawa Sports and Entertainment Group, it's been a revelation that I would never have imagined 5 to 7 years ago, with the success that we've had with the Red Blacks and the frustrations with the Ottawa Fury on soccer and I think the Ottawa 67s, which were my first true love in growing up in Ottawa as a youngster, and to be able to sit down with the coach and the GM of all of those teams. I'm going to be meeting with the coach and the GM of the Red Blacks to figure out why the hell, with first down on the 3-yard line against Montreal, we couldn't punch it across and at least tighten up the score last Friday night. Not to question the decision that they took, but as a fan, to be able to get their insights as to why the calls that were made were done. So it's super, super busy, and I'm very busy with community activities. I have been tapped to lead the fundraising for the new civic campus at the Ottawa Hospital, which will be a small campaign by Toronto standards, but it'll be a huge campaign by Ottawa standards. So I keep myself busy.
The other day I was in a meeting with Michael. You walked in army fatigues. Do you want to explain why you came in camouflage to the office that day?
Well, one of the I have difficulty sometimes saying no. So probably about 2 years ago, I was approached by the gentleman at the time was the commander of the 30th Field Artillery Regiment, and asked if I would consider to be the honorary colonel of the artillery unit. And I this might be a provocative statement. Probably one of the few things about Donald Trump that I do happen to agree with is when he talks about how poorly Canada is living up to its commitments in the defense field. And I share that. We have a strong affinity with the state of Israel, my Jewish background, and we've long supported lots of things in the state of Israel, and particularly its army. And I don't think that the people of Canada really have an appreciation of how fortunate we are. That we have an extremely professional army, underfunded a little bit, and perhaps a bit small, but when we're in a restaurant in Canada, we don't even think about watching the door to see who's going to come in. And of all the activities that I've done throughout my life, one of the things that I'd never done was to help our Canadian Army. So that was something that I decided was a hole that I think needed to be filled. And so I agreed. I took my command, I guess, on January 1st, and the head of the unit, the regiment in Ottawa, its nickname is the Bytown Gunners. He is a full-time, just retired from the Army. He's a lieutenant colonel, and I'm a full colonel. And the first time that we met on base, and he snaps a salute to me and calls me sir, and I'm going, whoa, because I'm usually a pretty informal guy. I'm only wearing a tie because of all of you. Normally I'm fairly casual, and I didn't know how to take that, so I said, David, please, I hope you're just doing that because you have to do it in front of all of your subordinates, but when we're alone, you're not going to call me sir. I just found that a bit odd, but it's been an incredible experience. Our Canadian Army, the men and women that serve in it are passionate about serving their country, and I have a slight regret when it was 38 degrees on Canada Day and I'm wearing a heavy wool suit, army suit on Parliament Hill as we're firing the ceremonial guns. But aside from that small regret, I have no regrets. I'm delighted to be doing that.
Good. Well, I want to take just a second to thank you. working sort of for you for the last 10 years. You've been a huge mentor for me personally, and I know you don't like to hear nice things, so I'll leave it at that, but it has been an amazing experience at Minto. As a token of the thanks from Informa, they've made a donation to OSEG's Charitable Foundation.
Oh, good, okay.
And just for everybody in the audience here, so the foundation supports amateur youth sports initiatives in the Ottawa and Gatineau region, and it supports and encourages increased youth participation in sports. So thank you, Roger.
My pleasure.
Thank you.